Mr. Trump has complained about, Taiwan sort of taking semiconductor technology, and he wants a better deal. He's going to be transactional on it, I imagine.
Ukraine is not the only country looking with concern at Washington, D.C. as Donald Trump prepares for a second term. The island of Taiwan, off the Chinese coast and constantly under threat of invasion from Beijing, is also wondering what will be in store for it. Can it depend on continued U.S. support for its independence? Or would Trump sell it down the river in some kind of deal he thinks would be to America's advantage? Let's speak to Professor Kerry Brown of King's College London, who has a new book out on the subject, The Taiwan Story, How a Small Island Will Dictate the Global Future. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's start with the most basic of questions. Why does China make such a huge issue of taking back Taiwan?
Well, the current regime in Beijing regards Taiwan as part of its inalienable territory, and it has since the Civil War in 1946 to 49. And so their attitude is that this is an unresolved part of that. It was always part of Chinese territory, and that therefore it needs to be returned to China. And under Xi Jinping, it's quite a nationalist, populist leadership. It's therefore important to kind of restore the integrity of the former country. Of course, historically, there's lots of arguments against whether that is the case, but it's certainly true that after the Second World War, the nationalist government then were given control of the whole country, and then they fled when they lost the Civil War in 49 to Taiwan. And so as of today, there are the two governments, one in Taiwan, one in Beijing, and they both don't agree with each other on the status of the island.
And in the early days, both were dictatorships. The government in Taiwan was a dictatorship too, just as the government in China was a dictatorship and still is. But Taiwan is now a democracy, quite a vibrant democracy, isn't it?
Indeed. I mean, from the 1990s, both in the parliamentary, the legislature, and then also the presidential elections in 1996, Taiwan kind of became, a very vibrant democracy. It's had handovers of power in 2000 from the Nationalist Party to what we call the Democratic Progressive Party. And then more recently in 2016, the Democratic Progressive Party re-won power. And they've just won another mandate this January in Taiwan. The current president is Lai Ching-te. He is regarded as a kind of more aggressive supporter of autonomy. And that is a bit of a problem because now you've got obviously very nationalistic Xi Jinping in Beijing, Lai Ching-te, a sort of strong supporter of Taiwan having greater autonomy, and the big unknown of what will Mr. Trump's attitude towards this whole situation be when he comes to power again in January next year.
If China was to move against Taiwan, would it be by blockade or would it be outright invasion?
An amphibious invasion would be a big, big ask, and it would be known about, obviously, before it happened.
Yes.
And people are observing the situation really closely. I mean, I think most people accept that a blockade gives, kind of more options to China. We have to remember, whatever China does, if its intent becomes, more long-term and it's definitely going to try and close down Taiwan's space decisively, that's going to have a colossal impact on the world's economy and supply lines. So, whatever it does, blockade or an absolute attack, neither are going to be soft options. They're all extreme.
Who would come to Taiwan's aid? It's a small island. I think population is about 26 million. Could easily be swallowed by China. It's well defended. It has pretty strong and impressive armed forces. I saw some of them myself when I was out before the pandemic. But who would come to its aid? America, I guess, in some form. Japan too, do you think? And who else?
Well, I think the blunt reality is if America doesn't come, I don't think anyone else will.
Nobody
that's
does.
The brute reality.
Nobody does.
Yeah, I mean, there's a Taiwan Relations Act from 1979, which is not a formal alliance treaty. It's a kind of an agreement that the administration must take to Congress, anything about the security of Taiwan. So there would be democratic support, I imagine, in the United States to do something. Mr. Trump has complained about, Taiwan sort of taking semiconductor technology, and he wants a better deal. He's going to be transactional on it, I imagine. Mr. Biden before was more about we will support Taiwan no matter what. It'll be like the Ukraine. We were a bit late there, but on Taiwan, we will stand by it, removing some of that ambiguity. To be honest, though, no one really knows. But as I think we all agree, the United States is the key player in this. It's not just China, Taiwan. It's always been, since the early 1950s, China, Taiwan, United States.
So if America did come to its aid, and I take your point that you can't be quite sure of that now with Mr. Trump heading back to the White House, but if it did, who else would then join if America's there?
Well, I think in the region there would obviously be a lot of support for Taiwan. I mean, Japan, you just referred to, I mean, they have a self-defense force. They want to up their military. The Australians would have to, because they have an actual alliance with the United States. I think it's more difficult to say about Philippines, Malaysia, and others. I mean,
Japan
all of them would
probably.
see this. Yeah, Japan would be most likely to. And I mean, Europeans would. I mean, you would assume that France, who's a big, France is a big military player in the region, ironically. I mean, the British, with their aircraft carriers now, probably would get involved. So there would be an alliance, but it would be accepted that America must take the lead every step of the way.
And what would the outcome be if you had this conventional force confrontation with the Chinese and the American navies, the American Navy supplemented, as you say, perhaps by Japan, which has a formidable navy of its own these days, the French, perhaps the British too. I mean, it would be tough, but a Chinese victory would not be guaranteed.
Oh, no way. No, it would be absolutely colossal endeavor. I mean, the last real amphibious landing was the D-Day landings. It's not easy. It's not easy.
And the coastline of Taiwan is difficult too.
Yeah, it's 100 kilometers of extremely difficult water. This would be one enormous endeavor. I mean, even if there were an amphibious landing, I mean, it's not just winning that victory, it's winning the peace. And the bottom line is that 23 million people on Taiwan regard themselves as Taiwanese. I mean, most have that understanding now. And so you would be dealing with an area where 23 million people, having been used to democracy and all of the identity around that, would now have to accept a very different future. That would not be a peace that you would easily win if you could win it. So it's not just about enforcement at the beginning, it's about what happens afterwards. And I imagine Beijing knows that, and it knows it would be difficult.
So it's not quite as simple for Beijing then as the numbers would suggest. This massive country, increasingly well armed, facing down this small island off its coast, because it would be a risk for the regime in Beijing, would it not, to risk a war that it might not win and could indeed seriously undermine the Chinese economy, which isn't doing that well these days anyway.
That's exactly true. I don't think Beijing, I mean, they're very risk averse despite all the rhetoric.
Yes.
The rhetoric is very fiery and very strong. But actually, it would be really a case of Beijing being pushed over a red line. There are two red lines. The first is if a leader of Taiwan says that it is independent. The second is if the United States, in particular, were to put an embassy in Taipei and to recognize independence. Those two would be the red lines. But I think apart from that, China would be very, very unlikely to do anything precipitate.
Taiwan makes, I'm just wondering, the global implications, I think, of any kind of hostilities, even a blockade, I don't think people understand. It's a kind of a small off island of which we know nothing, to paraphrase Chamberlain on Czechoslovakia. Taiwan makes most of the world's most sophisticated microchips. I would suggest, but you know more than I on this side, it's more likely that Taiwan would blow up its manufacturing capacity than allow it to fall into Chinese hands. And that if it did that, that would trigger a global recession. Would it not? Because we're all dependent on these sophisticated microchips.
Yeah, indeed. When I was in Taiwan in January, I went to the Taiwan Semiconductor and Manufacturing Corporation. 90% of the world's high-tech, semiconductors come from there. They're probably in devices that I've got and you've got. I mean, it's an incredible place. The amazing thing about that factory is that there's two things making it unique. One is it has a supply chain of about 650,000 different components. You cannot set that up overnight. And the second is it needs lots of very pure water. There are very, very few places that have that, and Taiwan in that location does. So, I mean, I think that you're right. Taiwan would be Silicon Shield at the moment. That's a bit of protection. But if there were war, it would be, likely that would go and the whole globe would be impacted. The supply chains would be ripped apart. Some said that it would take 40% of global GDP. I mean, that is a big, big hit.
A lot worse than the Great Depression of the 1930s.
Yeah, I mean, because Taiwan is integrated into so many very, very high value and highly important technical, kind of infrastructure, it's very hard to evaluate it. I mean, but we're talking trillions. This is an enormous problem.